Today's episode is brought to you by the Consultancy Growth Network. As you'll know, I'm a big believer in learning from people who've achieved the things that you want to. It's why I run this podcast, to share the stories of consulting leaders and how they've got to where they are today. So when I started talking to Mark Jansen and the team at Consultancy Growth Network, it was clear there was an obvious fit between Climate Consulting and their mission and what they are building with their network. But you're probably asking, what is the Consultancy Growth Network? The Consultancy Growth Network is the leading community of boutique consulting leaders. It brings together seasoned consulting growth experts who successfully scaled their own boutiques, with rapidly growing consulting founders looking to emulate their success. Now, you might be thinking, who are these growth experts? What do they actually know about consulting? And this is one of the most exciting things that personally I find about the network. The team at the Consultancy Growth Network have searched far and wide for some of the best boutique consulting leaders to help their members on their journeys, some of which I have previously interviewed for this podcast, such as Don Morehouse and Augusto Negrillo. But it's not just the insights from these people that you will benefit from. By joining, you get access to their jam-packed calendar of regular in-person and online events, their comprehensive growth hub of resources, and their active Slack community. Through all of these channels, you can learn, solve challenges, and achieve the goals you want for your firm. And now, if that wasn't enough reason to sign up, the Consultancy Growth Network is giving all listeners to this podcast a special sign-up offer. If you join for 12 months, you join for that next year, you will get your 13th month for free, giving you that extra month to continue to build on everything you're learning and continue to benefit from the network. To sign up, just visit consultancygrowthnetwork.com or contact their partnerships director, Luke at consultancygrowthnetwork.com. And when you're talking about joining, mention Create Engage or Climate Consulting, and you will get that special sign-up offer. Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Climate Consulting. In this one, we dive into probably one of the hottest topics in consulting. It's one of the areas that people have the most questions about. When you get past what we do at Create Engage with marketing, and we get a whole load of questions on how do you deliver effective marketing that generates return on investment, the next part of that question and the next part of that conversation is how do you then turn those leads into sales? How do you identify, manage, nurture those conversations, turn them into proposals, and ultimately create new work, new business for your consultancy? And today's guest, Alan Morton, Managing Director of SBR Consulting, is an expert on exactly this topic. SBR Consulting is a specialist global consultancy that focuses on growth and revenue acceleration, and have worked with a whole raft of consultancies, big and small, to help them transform their sales approach. The interview we held for this episode was actually on the day that SBR hit their 1,000th client milestone as a business, which just goes to show you how deep their expertise is in this space. In this conversation, Alan and I go into a whole host of topics that are going to help you grow your consultancy. We talk about how to demystify and democratize sales, a core focus for Alan and the team at SBR, and why they believe it's critical to remove those stigmas around sales and create a culture where everyone embraces it. We look at actually how do you create a strategy for sales and how do you move beyond hope? How do you develop a systematic approach to winning business? And what do you need to do in terms of training, coaching, and structures to be able to do this? And finally, we look at the systems that you can put in place to help improve your sales performance, your sales culture, and to truly democratize sales, as I mentioned, Alan is hugely passionate about. We talk about everything from the metrics to track through to the systems you can use to track them. This is an episode full of practical advice. And if you are currently wrestling with how to help your team sell more, how to potentially create more salespeople in your organization, how to build that culture that will help you grow your practice or your firm, then this is the episode for you. So with the intro over, please sit back, relax. I would suggest a notebook for this one and enjoy today's conversation with Alan Morton. Alan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
Well, thank you for coming to Bath. And I'm looking forward to this. Obviously, we've got to know each other. I heard you present at the recent TCGN event, and I thought it was fantastic. I thought it would be really helpful for my listeners. And so thank you for coming on the show.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Anything that gives us the chance to talk through, I guess, common growth challenges and potential solutions for those for consultancies. Always happy to bounce thoughts and ideas around. And it was great having you recently, actually, on one of our webinars. So glad to return the favor.
No, likewise. I think, as you in sales, us in marketing, they are two sides of a coin that I know consultancies can often find challenging. And I'm really excited today. So, we're probably going to get very practical into a lot of your frameworks, methodologies. I love frameworks. I love yours. I use them, and I'm really keen to share them with people. But I'm going to stop myself because we could get going before we've even told anyone who you are. So just for those who maybe don't know you, maybe those who aren't part of the Consultancy Growth Network yet, could you just give a brief overview on who you are and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, very happy to do that. So currently I'm joint MD at SBR Consulting. Along, some of your listeners might be familiar with Stuart Lotherington, who's my business partner, who's also been very active in the world of, I guess, sales transformation conversations within a consultancy context for a number of years. SBR, 22 years now. Today's quite auspicious, actually, because I got a notification that this week we've closed our 1,000th client, which obviously we've done many more projects than that, but we've had 1,000 different clients that we've worked with over the 22 years. And, those clients, many of them are consultancy professional services, technology companies with professional services functions within them. But typically we really focus on how do you build a growth engine into an environment where you remove the dependency on one or two talented people. And a lot of this is about how do you demystify, how do you democratize sales so it becomes a part of a culture. So I could talk all day, but I won't on that. Far more interested in talking about challenges that clients have.
Well, we are going to talk about some of that because I think when I heard you talk about democratizing sales, it really resonated. But to your point of maybe we start with the challenge, what for you mentioned, and congratulations on 1,000, by the way.
Yeah, we're excited. It's a good number.
It was a very good number. When we did our webinar, I thought we had a nice list, but when you put yours up, if it was top trumps, you definitely won on that side of things.
Well, I think you're catching up, though.
We'll try. 22 years later, and we'll come back for this. And what are, as you mentioned, this podcast is for consultancies. A lot of our listeners are boutique consultancies, but boutique can mean anything from 2 people to 2,000 people. What are those most frequent sales challenges that you find someone picks up the phone or when you're in? What are those?
I mean, if I think back just from some of the conversations that we've had in the last couple of weeks, classic themes are, concentration risk and dependencies. So, dependency on a key client, or even worse, a key project, or even worse, a key contact that actually, when you roll it back, I'm thinking there was a software technology services business I worked in Bath a number of years ago. When we actually looked at things, we could see that their whole business was hanging on the thread really of 1 or 2 key relationships, because that concentration risk was there. And then internally, who held that relationship was one person on their side. So, classic, that person wins the lottery, gets run over by a bus, retires. What happens to that organization because of that concentration risk? And alongside that, that dependency that people have on the rainmaker winning the work and feeding the rest of the organization. So many things come down to that. And then it's a case of, well, how do we mitigate against that risk to also unlock the growth potential that sits within the organization? If we could just actually develop a culture where sales is seen as something that's not a dirty word, which, it's crazy. 20 years on from when we started, that was a concern. Still, there are some environments where people run away from the fact that it's a necessity, but it can also be something that adds a tremendous value when it's done in a proper ethical way. And people are really just thinking about building trust and providing insight and being curious. If they start seeing what the approach to sales should be, often we then start seeing that people will start embracing it, and you'll naturally remove some of those concentration risks which are holding so many businesses back from achieving what their potential actually is.
I think that concentration risk piece is fascinating. And maybe, Alan, and if this is too much of a tangent at the moment, stop me, but to your point around what sales really is, I do wonder if there's maybe to then tee us up for the rest of the conversation, actually, what do you see as sales? Because like you say, it's a dirty word in some contexts. I'm at the age where people called at dinner time to sell you stuff on the phone. Right. I don't think that happens now because you don't have phones in the house. But what is selling to you?
Well, done correctly, it's a mutual exchange of value. And it's about having the conversations and building the relationships and the trust that are necessary so that, the client receives an outcome which is tangible and, naturally, and we all know win-win, we'll have all heard of that, but, there should be a relationship that's established, which is beneficial to both parties. So, that mutual exchange of value based on really strong trust-based relationships and that exchange of insight in a consulting context is often where it comes down to. So we're able to help to accelerate, the journey that somebody's on. And as a result from that, that mutual exchange of value means that we both win. So that's what it should be. I think too many people are stuck in that situation of, well, if I win, they lose, or in order for them to win, I have to lose, and none of that's healthy. So yeah, we could probably talk a lot more and esoterically about it, but as a quick definition, that's probably where I'd start.
Well, I think it's really useful as well, and to your point, just to get us and our listeners on the same page, and also to out one of those, I guess, common concerns of is sale, it's a dirty word, or is it, like you say, it's a win-lose? And I guess to your point of those common challenges that you see, to bring us back to that, why do those tend to occur? Is it because people see it as a win-lose, or what are those, I guess, things that if someone's listening to this and they want to spot these in their business, what's that kind of second order problem that maybe they can catch before they end up with, a client who's 90% of their revenue, for instance?
Well, the first thing is to have really strong visibility in terms of, where your revenue is coming from, to see where those risks are. And also, what's the origination? And this goes back to, understanding when we're winning, where do our projects and our clients start? So, lead source, for example, are we entirely dependent on people coming to us, or are we proactively originating work? And you talk about themes and some of the things that we hear so many frustrated managing partners and people who've founded consultancies talking about the fact, I need my team to be more proactive. And that's not just from revenue, but that's also about repositioning them from being the reactive service provider to actually, the mythical beast that we all talk about in the world of consulting, of the trusted advisor. And a lot of our programs are actually with delivery teams, where it's all about how do we shift their perspective from, a hope-based approach to growth of we do great work and hopefully they'll come back when they need more, to a true advisory piece of work, which is actually we're working on a project and we can see that there's a potential challenge ahead of them that isn't on the radar. How do we have that advisory-based conversation to open up the aperture to actually recognize that there's opportunity or risk where they can deliver value? And again, we get back to that, what is sales? It's a mutual exchange of value, because by guiding and shaping, not just reacting and responding, people put themselves in a position to be much more in control of their destiny. And you'll actually build much, much better client relationships off the back of it, rather than being put in the commodity box, which so many consultants end up being put into, because people eventually think, well, you know what, there's others who can do this. But what people really want is someone who can not just respond and react, but who can help to structure thinking and advise. Anyone in the consultancy world knows that. Unfortunately, very few practice it. And, that's often the unlock that we see really starts driving growth.
Amazing. And I do want us to come on to that, because I suspect that's where we will lead into that democratizing piece, because, your point there around the proactiveness, like you say, it's something all consultancies have certain common challenges. And one is, if only my team did X more. And again, more as placing for our listeners, you gave the example of where someone founds a firm, the managing partner of, say, a smaller boutique, and they are the inverted commas rainmaker. How do those challenges you've talked about around proactivity, around client density, around that piece of kind of reliance on a single person, given you've worked with 1,000 firms, and I know in that it's everyone from small to super big, are there any challenges that are specific by size, or actually is that something you see across all of that?
We see that across all of it. I mean, because lots of consultancies have grown with that sort of classic sort of pod-based model, partner feeding a certain group of people. So within each of those, and that might be a practice area, for example, those dependencies absolutely exist. And I don't think we've ever spoken to a consulting leader who disagrees with the idea that, they need more of their team who are client facing and delivery focused to become comfortable with the growth conversation. And, usually what we see is the people who make partner are the ones who figure it out. Unfortunately, they often figure it out based on emotional intelligence and strong people skills. So they're the classic unconscious competent. So, they'll make assumptions that's what's obvious to them is obvious to everybody else. So they're not then in a position to replicate their effectiveness and lift others up in and around them. Or with a lot of those larger firms, we see that they've grown to a significant size, potentially based on a market context which is changing. And, the classic tailwinds have driven growth. Maybe they did have a true competitive advantage when it came to the proposition, the tooling that they potentially used to enable them to get there. But again, with that, so much disruption in the sort of the macro environment at the moment, what we're seeing is that people are in this situation suddenly where they're thinking, well, our position is being eroded. Lots of the boutique consultancies, as you say, are coming along and actually nibbling away at the position that maybe some of the larger consultancies traditionally operated in. And we see in those very large organizations that the concern is actually that, share is dipping and declining, and what's got them where they are isn't going to keep them there. So, fundamentally, that's where they then need people to shift who were used to responding to demand to actually get out there and be proactive and, stop seeing themselves as the expert that people turn to when they need help and start being, a little bit more humble, a little bit more curious, and a lot more proactive. Back to that word, to actually maintain that position and help them grow. So I think some of those bigger firms are seeing that erosion, whereas the smaller firms, it's again, let's capitalize on opportunity, but the underpinning aspect is often just lack of sales culture and acceptance at enough levels away from that risk of having just one or two people who are driving the growth.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating point, like you say, of it's the same challenge seen differently, the big firms being nibbled away at versus the small firms not having enough to nibble on, to get those deals. And that point around, if you can do it, you might not be able to teach it. Not every player is a good manager, as we see in whatever sport you follow. And I mean, this might be a good point for us to move into that how to and that democratizing piece, because I think in what you've said, you've teased it, and I'd love to dive into that, because I guess that's where anyone listening is going to be able to go, well, wow, now I can start to think about this. So actually, what does democratizing sales, let's start there, mean to you, mean to SBR, and why is that so important for consultancies?
Well, fundamentally, you're creating feet in the street. You're creating reach. You're, so much of what you do is obviously creating reach and, exposure for people. But actually, if we think about how many of the people that are regularly in contact with clients and potential clients have the confidence and the capability to engage in a way that builds trust and uncovers opportunity. And then when opportunity is uncovered, have the confidence to actually then progress an opportunity through to the point of conversion. Ideally, the point of conversion where the project covers the full breadth of the potential solution set that is available, as opposed to what we often observe, especially in the larger firms, is they might have one or two people who are very good at selling the thing that they're familiar with because that's where their expertise was. But actually, it's not necessarily servicing the client in the way that it should do, because there's a lot more value that they could add if they were talking about a more joined up end-to-end proposition that draws on the capabilities that sit within the firm. We see this all the time in multidisciplinary type environments. And, obviously the unlock there is how do we cross-sell? How do we upsell? How do we take advantage of the white space, especially large firms who've grown through M&A? That's the classic where, well, we take this and there's a natural adjacency. Let's combine them together. And then instantly our deal sizes will go up. And then post-acquisition, the realization is, well, everybody's still just talking about and positioning what they've always positioned. And we're not capitalizing on that potentially broader proposition that would really add value to our clients. So a lot to drill down on. But I think the democratization is how many individuals within the organization who are client facing outside of the one or two partners can confidently and capably have those types of conversations to unlock those opportunities.
I think a great explanation and really showing the benefits. I think because it'll take me potentially somewhere, to your point of how many people, who are client facing can do this. Do you have a kind of rule of thumb? Like, is it success is democratizing to 50% of your team? Is it actually you want 100% of your team? I'm curious because it will lead us somewhere or may lead us somewhere.
Yeah, well, I think it's a brilliant question. And I mean, to a certain extent, just before we started recording, we were talking about classic challenges that we all have in the world of consultancy about resource and revenue and balancing those two things out. So, obviously it has to be how far you want to go with it is how much capacity do you have to deliver successfully? Because we absolutely wholeheartedly believe that, you need to set clear expectations and deliver on promises and deliver an outcome. So if you're building a sales engine that basically is creating so much opportunity that you can't fulfill correctly, you've probably got the balance wrong. But I think in answer to the question there, if it's just the partner group who are originating everything, that's too concentrated. The managing consultants, the principal consultants should be thinking about this. And some of it goes back to that point of what expectation has been defined internally for what people need to be able to do in order to progress through the different grades, which brings us into, territories like, chargeability rates, utilization, but also how well defined are the sales targets and the sales expectations that people have or have on them in order to help them move, up the levels so that actually there's a clarity there within people's minds about what they need to do to climb the ladder. Because we're still amazed that some people just think, well, I don't need to sell to get to partner, do I? Well, you certainly need to sell to stay at partner. So it probably makes sense to actually, have some element of that in order to get to partner. I don't know if that answers the question.
It definitely does in that, as you said, it's not just the partner level. And if I'm inferring from you, just going to that partner -1, whether you call it principal or whatever you call it, probably isn't completely enough. I think it, though, leads to an interesting area. And what I might do, Alan, is most of my listeners will know I tend to just ask huge questions and let you pick at the bits you like. So this might be a broad question, but I think ties into everything you were just touching on and will lead us into actually, how do I implement this? Because you hit on a fascinating point. And so I think there's a cultural question, there's a measurement question, there's a leadership question, all wrapped here in one. Is if I'm running a boutique, so let's make some assumptions here. I'm running a smaller boutique. Smaller can mean anything, but often boutiques that are not the big four trade on not being the big four. So it's the old, you won't have sales targets. You won't, you won't be pushed on this. Just come and do your best work. So you've got a question there around, well, how do you build that culture? So how do you take, I guess, those consultants and how do you take your firm? If I'm sitting here today as a consulting leader, I've got a firm of people who have joined me as delivery folk because they love delivery. I've got a leadership team of, say, however many partners, but we're the only rainmakers. I know that leads come from me, but I'm not sure where else. Like, actually, what are those initial steps I should be taking to move me in the right direction? Because I believe what you're saying. I'm just scared shitless that if I suddenly target everyone, they're going to leave tomorrow.
Yeah. And I think this is about evolution, and it's about recognizing that you need to take people on a journey. And it's absolutely not about taking people from a comfort zone into a panic zone. It is, though, identifying that there's a stage between comfort and panic, which is stretch. And, if we're not stretching ourselves, then that's probably, that's a bigger issue. We should always be looking to stretch ourselves. And what we often find I'm not saying that the first step is everybody needs a sales target tomorrow. Absolutely not. It might be, though, as simple as we give people the opportunity to have slightly broader conversations where their natural curiosity will lead them, that will result in opportunities being uncovered. So we've gone into some organizations where everybody from a delivery perspective is, 100% is the expectation. 100% of their time, they're billable and chargeable. So there's no space for them to do so. So people think, oh, well, I'm then going to stick a sales target on them. Of course, they're going to, that's panic zone straight away. And I can absolutely understand that, because, it's that old thing around, if you want behavior, you've got to be thinking about, capacity or capability, opportunity, and motivation, and then that leads to, the behavior side. So are we giving people some space to actually engage with their network? And, we're huge believers in the coffee conversation. As, I think any of us who've spent any time around consultancy know that the people who often get the rainmaker tag are the ones who are regularly nurturing their network, because what they recognize is that their network is going to be their net worth. And they find time to engage with that network, meet people, just to have an exchange of ideas, to continually, develop the intimacy that's such a fundamental part of building trust. But if there's no time, then they can't do that. So that might be the first step, just to encourage people to go out and have curiosity-led conversations with people in their network, which, as they go through and ask great questions. As consultants, we can all ask great questions, share a bit of insight, uncovers an opportunity. And then suddenly it's that confidence to flag that there's an opportunity. And with some organizations, what we see, it's just as simple as, we've got a great client that we've worked with for a number of years in different ways. Initially, it was about establishing sales process. Then it was about defining methodology and language. It was about putting measurement in place, working with leadership. And now we're very much, with new intake, we'll go in and do some baselining to align people around the sort of the methodology and the language they have. But they have a expression that they talk about, a hear and report back. And that's become institutionalized within their organization. For the job of people who are out delivering is to create space to hear what the challenges are that are sit within the business, that are outside of the immediate scope that they're operating on, and report back. And that report back might be to the client partner, whose job it is to then make the proactive approach and say, hey, we think we might potentially be able to help you with, is that a conversation that's worth having? And if they've got a good governance cadence of project catch-ups in terms of the way they manage the account, they can use those to seed ideas, share thoughts, some of which naturally will convert into projects and revenue. And of course, not all will. But by doing that, they're seen as actually taking an interest in the growth of the firm or the growth of the client, as opposed to just, we're the expert, call us in when you have a problem to solve, and then we'll leave, which actually potentially is putting them into a commodity trap, because they're not the only people who can do what they do. Some of their value add is technical strength, but also intimacy, strategic alignment, and a true interest in doing what's right for the client's long-term interest and mid-term interest, not just the short-term immediate project in front of them. So again, you asked me a broad question. I gave you a broad answer. Happy to drill down on any of that from my perspective.
Well, I think it was a really good answer, and that you touched on some areas, and I've just been noting down kind of themes, because I think what I heard from you, just to make sure I caught it right for our listeners, is there is firstly a capacity challenge. Yeah. Because to your point, if my business expects my team to be billable 100%, they're never going to do the extra because there's no extra time to do the extra. And this might take us on a tangent, but I think there's a really important piece in here. You mentioned around being big believers in coffees, and there was a really nice piece. It feels like structure. And I think structure might be an interesting place to dig in, because you touched on curiosity-led conversations, which I'd love to maybe in a minute hear more on, because, and I say this, hopefully we'll still remain friends at the end of this, I think a lot of consultancies abuse the coffees as an excuse to catch up with your mates and talk about football. And I think there's something really interesting, which is why I'm fascinated in what you were talking about, is how does someone help their team go that level on? Because it might be someone's listening to this thinking, my team are having coffees every bloody day and we've got nothing. And you sort of teased some of those bits in what you were saying, but I'd love to dig into that kind of, how do I structurally create a curiosity-led conversation that leads to an insight that could lead to something further?
I think, and we're definitely still friends, because you're absolutely right that I think there's a first step in terms of, okay, well, let's make sure that they're connecting and that they're having conversations. Then what we've got to move on to is, are they having effective conversations? And well, what's an effective conversation? An effective conversation is a conversation that uncovers or stimulates an opportunity, fundamentally, and we're great believers in the fundamental reality of the funnel, which, is interesting because we get a lot of consultants who will dispute the reality that there's a funnel. Of course there is. But then equally, from a process improvement perspective, and often these are actually often consultancies that really buy into principles of process improvement. But if we think about, a sales process, there's a conversation. Where that conversation's come from, you do a brilliant job within what Create Engage do, helping people to get those conversations. But then how do they turn those conversations into something? That's often the disconnect, because people are uncomfortable with the idea of, well, how do I leverage a personal relationship into a business benefit? And part of our aspect is we'll be upfront, about it. It's not about sort of, any element of being insincere. There can be that aspect, especially if people are maybe reaching out to parts of the network where the relationship's a bit dormant. Someone that you used to work with on a project who's maybe in a new role. Think about, well, what's the value that I can add to them? And actually think about, how can I potentially help this person? Great question, which often reframes things for people. It's not, I don't want to sell something to them. How do I help them? Based on, me understanding a little bit about the context that they're in and their organization's in, and thinking about our capabilities, where's the potential value that I can add? And can I articulate that with a hypothesis where someone feels that the benefit of spending half an hour with me is worth the cost in terms of time to them? And then when we structure that conversation, the curiosity-led conversation is, okay, well, hey, from the outside, I can see this. I'm curious, is that accurate? What are some of the challenges? Help me understand. We think we might potentially be able to help. Here's some stories and examples. The art of storytelling is such a huge one, to have an effective conversation. And then actually, potentially, as a good coach would do, some of it is about asking the questions that get people to stop. And, we refer to a light bulb moment, and really great consultants have the ability where they've maybe thought through, what questions am I going to ask in this conversation in order to create those light bulb moments of realization that there's a potential challenge or opportunity that wasn't on my radar that now is, at which point the individual can then position services against that realization to create an opportunity. Now, that might end up being an opportunity that you end up helping that client with, or it might be an opportunity that they've got the in-house capability to do. But we're still seeing that, creating realization, that's adding value to that individual. We're helping the individual by starting with curiosity, understanding context, and then positioning thoughts and ideas that may not be on their radar that help them see that there's challenges or opportunities that they could and should be focusing on that will help them succeed individually and help their organization succeed collectively.
I think it's a great explanation, and your point on reframing help, because back to what you said and why I was keen to get that definition of sales at the start is there's so many misconceptions wrapped up in that one word. And even, to your point, I'm a big believer like you, and it's all giving value. Sometimes people are unclear, what does giving value mean? And your point of helping, is a great way of saying, well, actually, if you work in the insurance market as a consultant, you could give value or you could help by telling an insurer what the market's like, because clients only work in their one sector, for instance, or their one firm. I really hope you are enjoying today's episode of Climbing Consulting. If you want to get ahead, you want to move your consultancy, your career forward, and you want to learn even more, then I would definitely recommend checking out our brand new marketing-focused podcast, Brand and Deliver. In this series, we dive in to the best, the latest, the newest in consulting marketing and professional services marketing at large to help you get the edge in your firm. If you go to your podcast app, type in Brand and Deliver, it'll be there, or go to our website to podcast and you can find it there and click your favorite episode. I hope you enjoy it. And there's an element I just want to check again for sort of anyone who's kind of mid-taking notes about this, because to your point, Alan, around having questions and what you said earlier around some people can be unconsciously competent at, I'm just great at having coffees. Would you recommend someone actually, a script for this, a kind of key questions? How do you typically suggest rolling that out? If I was listening, I was like, I want to give everyone something to have a coffee. How would you go about doing that?
Yeah, great question. So when we think about the whole enablement side of things, because it is the classic advice that gets given to people, just go have coffees with your network. How? And that's often the disconnect for people, because, the people who are making that suggestion have been doing it for so long that they forgot they ever needed guidance. So structures and frameworks are really helpful for people. So, some specific questions absolutely will help. And, if people are thinking about, the go-to-market of a new proposition, one of the best things that they can do isn't to teach people how to pitch that proposition. They need to think, well, what are the questions that lead people to the realization that they may have a need that is fulfilled by that proposition? And that's often what we don't see. People are, worst case, they're given a pitch deck. Here's a deck, go have a coffee, and, effectively, obviously not literally, but, hit people over the head with this slide deck talking about how brilliant the proposition is. And, that is the absolute opposite thing that people should be doing. They should be going out and thinking, well, what are the questions that might lead people to the realization that there's a need? And then you can fulfill that need by talking about what the proposition may well be. But, I think too many people have watched Mad Men over the years where they think it's all about the pitch, and even a well-articulated pitch. And we all need to do that at some point. There should be an element of, okay, why change? Why now? Why us? But the why change is all about the audience and their context. It's not the why us, which unfortunately, when we review lots of creds decks that consultancies go out and present, the first 10 slides, nothing to do with the client. It's everything to do with their organization. And, the irony is more than once we've seen people where, let's talk about us. And the first point is we're all about the client. Don't say anything, Mr. Client. I'm too busy telling you how the client's really important to us. And it's a ridiculous situation and I'm overplaying it slightly, but that's the reality where people haven't thought about the customer experience. And so those coffees should start with curiosity. They should move into insight. From insight, they should move into, co-creation of potential solutions. Storytelling should be wrapped around it. And there needs to be a moment where you test commitment by thinking about, well, what's the incremental next step? But if more people would think as they go into those coffees about the objectives that they've got, and if more people would think not about what they're going to say, but what are the questions that they're going to ask, they would be much more successful in terms of making valuable time from that coffee, as opposed to potentially it being seen as a waste of time from the other person's perspective. Because when we're trying to catch up with people, we should always be thinking, how do I deliver value to the other person so that they, ideally, next time we suggest a coffee, actually agree that it's something that's worthwhile them doing in amongst everything else that they could be doing in both their professional and their personal life.
I mean, so much great advice in there, Alan, and there's probably a whole nother podcast on pitch decks, which I won't, to your point of too many consultants lead with, I won't open up too much other than to say, your advice there is brilliant. And I do remember being in consulting, and I have seen plenty of consulting pitch decks since, where it is very much the first 10 slides are just us. And also the pitch deck is 50 slides. And I think it might have been yourself who I've robbed this from. I always use it and I can't remember. So if it's you I've robbed it from, tell me. But I really live by, and with our clients, confused buyers don't buy and confused sellers don't sell. And I know it's a jump. We'll come back to where we were. But did I take that from you?
It's certainly a mantra we use. I won't claim that we came up with it. So who knows? I think this is the crazy thing in many ways. There's so much truth that is out there that is defined and known, but unfortunately it lives in people's heads. And this goes back to how do you democratize? Well, firstly, you need to demystify. And actually, it's just those truisms that, confused customers do not buy, confused salespeople do not sell. Totally agree. I'm not going to claim that we came up with that. We certainly talk about it a lot, though.
Well, I can say I took it from you, and I'll let people come to you and talk about it more, because I think it ties back to also what you said, and the way you finished your answer as well, I think really reinforces that need for structured questions and thought up front, because you framed it as, well, someone might not get any value from this in a coffee, which is very true. I think the coffees that kind of sit in between useful and obviously useless are the ones where, to your point, you could have a great chat, build a relationship. And actually what that means is, Alan, we talk about football, if football's your thing, or rugby, if rugby's your thing. And actually you can end, I will ask, do you find you get clients where they have a problem where they filled their diary with 50 coffees, but actually, to your point, if you haven't had those questions, you end up, I now know a lot about rugby, I don't know a lot about client X's problems.
Yeah, and it's, we often, another thing that we talk about within the business, which we certainly didn't come up with, is, this whole idea that hope isn't the strategy. And, we see many people's approach to winning business is a hope-based strategy. So just going out and having coffees and hoping that clients are going to rain from the sky, that's a hope-based strategy. And, if you do enough of it, it's certainly better than, the alternative, which is sitting there crossing your fingers, hoping that someone will knock on your door. So that's a step in the right direction. But, that's along a journey that we'd say you're going from hope to at least hearing. The next step from here is to ask, which is the whole questionings piece. And then from ask, you may get into the very proactive influence side of things, where, you're very much going out with a defined proposition and, an articulation of why change, why now, why us in that way. And, there's certain situations where we do have to pitch, we have to. But, that thinking about that as a spectrum is useful in terms of where are you sitting? Is it a hope-based approach? We're just going out, meeting people, talking about rugby and, praying that someone will say, oh yeah, I've got £1 million project for you. Or are we going out and asking questions that might lead to, or are we really asking and shaping the demand that might create the realization that they have the needs? Well worth reflecting on, because we see that there's too many people who are at the hope-based end. And you can tell this if you're tracking the right things. I had this conversation this week with a client in a consultancy who, their growth has been phenomenal. They've done extraordinarily well as an organization. But it's interesting, they're getting to the inflection point where they need to put a bit more structure and rigor around the approach to sales. And the one thing that they're not looking at is what activity is happening. How active are our key people with their networks? But more important than that is what outputs are coming from that activity. And this is back to just thinking about conversion rates, because if you're having 50 coffees and you're creating no opportunity, you're either meeting the wrong people or you're meeting the right people in the wrong way. So if we think about a workflow or a sales process, if we want to look at that, there should be these milestone events, and just like a project, that there's you work it back. Here's the output that we need, and you work back and figure out what the milestones are. You track and you measure, and you have some governance around that. We can and we should be doing the same thing with sales, and that's when you have an effective sales process, when you've got the visibility of not just activity, but are we doing intelligent activity, or as my good friend Stuart Lotherington would say, income producing activity, which he's a big fan of IPA. So
Well, I think it's a great phrase because it also reinforces, to your point, we can all, and as consultants, and I say this as a formal one, we're very good at rationalization. So I can rationalize anything as being good, but to Stuart's point, income producing is a very defined end goal. And I think that's a really nice phrase that's a focus. I guess to your point, you've actually brought me to one of the areas I wanted to touch on, Alan, because I think in this sort of theme of if I'm listening and I want to improve my sales, we've talked about, the why, we've talked about some of that kind of how to get the team moving. And I think your point that you were coming on to, and I'd love to elaborate on, is that measurement piece, because I think there's two parts, and I'm sure you can share. There's what do I track? And probably, I'd love to get your thoughts on, is it leading, is it lagging type indicators? Because I could track revenue. Is that is that rain? And then, there's the other obvious, and this might be something you weave in, is we all know the sales process is long. So you mentioned there is a funnel. I agree with you, but let's assume our listeners, aren't quite clear. My sales process could be 6, 12, 24 months. How do I bring together some measurements if I've got nothing right now that starts to let me know I'm going in the right direction?
Right. Yeah. Great question. And literally, again, this week was having exactly that conversation with a client around that forward visibility. And let's face it, this is critical for all of us in a consulting world, because it's that forward visibility that enables us to make the decisions that we need to around resourcing. Are we going to hire? Are we going to open up a new market? Are we going to talk to that trusted associate about maybe coming on board and taking on a full-time role within the organization? Do we have the potential to do that? And the problem for too many people is they're only measuring, what they're measuring is historical. So everything's backwards looking. There's no predictability. And actually, the reason for that lack of predictability is often that they're not thinking about the lead indicators. So they haven't got the ability to forward forecast with any clarity. And we're back to hope being the strategy in and around that. So if you want to hear effectively, we'll make sure that you've got the visibility that sits around, the funnel metrics. So, some of those areas might be, as we think about pipeline health. So that would be one thing. Obviously, if you haven't, depending on what stage you're at, if you haven't got visibility on what's in the pipeline and your sales process broken down in a way so that there's the appropriate weightings in the opportunity funnel for early stage, that's 10%, 25%, 75%, whatever it might be. And, you can use some generic metrics, but ideally what you should be doing is tracking the probabilities using actual data.
And just so I'm clear for our listeners, the probabilities of conversion, is that?
Yes.
Okay, so a stage 1, 10%, you're saying 1 in 10 of these will convert, etc.
Absolutely. And you might have to start with a hypothesis around that, and then you test that hypothesis by actually capturing the data. Now, if you can get to the point where you don't just have, where you have those total conversions, but you also have stage to stage conversions, what percentage that go on here, move on to here. I sat in a presentation yesterday. One of the things we do is due diligence for different investors on the strength, let's say, of the sales capability that sits within, some of their target investments and some of their portfolio companies. And we saw a brilliant example yesterday of an organization that really knows its stuff, because they pulled up and they were able to present their pipeline metrics, their stage to stage conversions. They were really on top of the data. And this is if you like, the science of selling that is complemented by the art of selling. And, many of your readers or listeners, I should say, will, I'm sure, be familiar with that people talk about sales being an art and a science. It's true. And it all comes down to, thinking about the reality of what the numbers tell us, so the conversion rates are there.
And just because you used a term, and I always try not to knock you off track, but just because I want to, for my listeners, get the definition. Stage to stage conversion means how many go from stage A to stage B.
Exactly.
Perfect.
Exactly. And that can be done on a conversion. It can also be done on a velocity perspective, because you talk about, we've got long cycles. Often they are. A question that I'd ask, anyone listening to reflect on is, what is your average sales cycle? And if you don't know, that would be a great thing to get a handle on, again, to help you predict, forward predictability. But you can then think about the velocity or the stage duration of each stage, which actually enables you to get a sense of actually how healthy is our pipeline. Because I'm sure many people now will be sitting thinking about their pipeline that actually there's quite a few things that feel like they're stuck. It's been in there for a while. And when you've got a well-defined sales process with an appropriate number of stages, you should be able to see a consistent flow of opportunities through that, which includes actually, opportunities are qualified out or drop out at this stage. That's a sign that you've got a really good sales engine when you've got the visibility on those funnel metrics, pipeline metrics right the way through the process. But to your point about lead and lagging, this is then the piece that people often miss because they misinterpret, in our opinion, an output metric for an activity metric. So I was having a conversation this week with someone around, MQLs. So my question was, well, what's an MQL?
It's a question I ask very often. I was asking it this week as well, Alan.
I was thinking to myself, this is one that we could debate all day long. Well, we probably quite aligned, but the interesting thing, this organization, they didn't have a definition. So understandably, everyone in their organization interpreted that in a different way. But what they weren't doing was they weren't thinking about the activity measures that sit above, a potential MQL from a being proactive perspective. There's the marketing generated MQLs. And then there's people working their networks and uncovering leads in that way. And, there needs to be a certain sophistication to how people think about that. But from the proactive side, we'd say that's where things like the quantity of coffee catch-ups is a good thing for people to know because, and how many of those are actually following through in terms of creating opportunities. Again, the visibility on that will give people much, much more predictability and control over their revenue. And actually, at the start of the year, they can then backwards plan a revenue number back to something which is much more controllable. So this would be another mantra, not ours, but definitely one that we talk about, control the controllables. So within your business, figure out what the controllables are. And those are the things that you should have measurement around because guess what? We get more of what we measure. So let's measure the things that aren't just influenceable, but are controllable as well. And in that way, we can create a lot more predictability over the success of our business.
Yeah, I think some great advice there. And I'm going to, in a minute, ask some practical questions that might help people unlock some of that. But just to touch on your point around that stage gates, I won't open the debate around MQLs. I know we've got lunch after this, so that might be like you said, I think with us, it'll be a very short debate. Yeah. But I think to your point, that whole stage gating and what you said around controlling the controllables, you need to understand what you control, what drives that, leads, what drives those sales, because that's also where, from a marketing perspective, and I know we chatted about this on the webinar, I often see marketing get a bad rap because it's like, well, it didn't get us £1 million next week. And I often tell people we're not Amazon. If you're selling something that's £5, the sales time is a lot shorter than £1 million. But to your point, having those metrics is really key. And this may feel like an obvious question, but I don't know how obvious it is across our industry. How do you capture those metrics? We talk about funnels, we talk about pipes. I'm being facetious here, but we're not telling people to actually go to the plumber's merchant. Like, how do I capture things? And maybe it's better, what are the challenges you see around that? I'll ask that question and let you answer it. So that, what are the challenges that stop people actually being able to do that metrics piece?
Well, a lot of it actually is, a failure of change management where people may have implemented something. And again, people go to panic zone because the interpretation is, I'm being micromanaged, or this is going to be used as a stick to beat me with. And unfortunately, that too often is the case. And so there's no incentive for people to want to do it. Our view is that organizations that are successful have a strong coaching culture and they have a developmental culture. And the best way to build an effective developmental culture is to have, not just opinion, but some facts. And the data, the funnel metric can, at an individual level, really help you identify where people's development needs are. Just that aspect of someone who's having lots of network connections and not creating any opportunity there, straight away, I think, brilliant. They're active, but we need to help them understand how to access the right people and how to have that conversation in the right way. So, there's often that positioning hasn't happened at the front end. Then the follow through is wrong, where people are. I met a sales leader in a technology business at a strong professional services organization, and I just reminded, it was a gentleman from across the pond, shall we say, and his response was, I believe in the, I believe in the stick and the carrot, and when the stick breaks, I hit people with the carrot. And straight away I was thinking, oh my God.
I'm sure that's not the method you advocate, but it's a fantastic phrase, isn't it?
100% not what we'd advocate. And it just showed, okay, here's somebody who doesn't understand the value and the insight that's locked up by having the right data to enable them to then, invest and support and develop their team. So yeah, I think failure of change management in terms of people don't understand the why. And then the execution, people use that data in the wrong way. And, nobody's ever helped an individual understand what's in it for them and actually sold the value of them having the discipline to track. And I mean, it makes us smile because in so many aspects of life, people are used to, they recognize the need to track to drive performance.
Well, with our phones these days, yeah. I never knew how many steps I walked until about 10 years ago. And now it's all you think about.
100%, and, any of us, who've been to a personal trainer, we tell them what the outcome is, and then they work it back and they help us put a plan in place. And then we hold ourselves and we help get people around us to help hold ourselves accountable to the process that will realize that outcome. That same principle applies. And again, back to mindset and demystifying and democratizing sales. If thinking about sales as a project and actually doing the things that help any project succeed, you have a project plan, you have milestones, you have governance, all those things that help people be successful in the successful delivery of a project or a program will help people be successful if they're thinking project sales or project revenue. And it's applying those principles, but doing it in the right way where, from a leadership perspective, it has to be about how do we develop our teams as opposed to, having too much stick and not enough carrot.
I think a fantastic answer. And to your point, some rich themes in there around, like you said, that culture and that coaching and seeing, I loved your example of seeing lots of coffees, but less results as something for celebration and coaching rather than, to your point, like, you're shit at sales, so you go and do delivery, which whether overtly or implicitly, I think sometimes can be the failing kind of, is like, even just by omission, if the person who's getting the high fives is over there and it's not you, like that can feel hard for people. I think this may feel again obvious, but I'm interested because it's something I do hear a lot in our market of your example and what we talked about. You mentioned personal training, like everyone's got a fitness app and you track your workouts or whatever. If people actually want to do this, what do they need from a systems perspective? Like you say, it's a project. If I'm doing a project, I use MSP. CRM can sometimes be seen as dirtier word as sales. And I just love your advice. If I'm listening to this, I've got nothing. Do I need to go and spend 50 grand on HubSpot? Do I need to go and get Salesforce? Like, what do I actually do?
No, there's so many options that are available that are out there. And actually, again, it's all about, maturity. I think if we drive it right down to the basics, and it's interesting with CRM, it would be insane to use our customer relationship management platform to manage our customer relationships, right? Which is actually the crazy thing. So, being transparent, we use Salesforce.
I just was saying that was not a slight on Salesforce.
No.
It's I just know it's at the premium end versus other options.
Yeah, absolutely. But equally, we've seen people be very successful with open source. HubSpot, Pipedrive. There's so many options that are out there. And, the investment, I think, shouldn't be a barrier. But underpinning it is still the, garbage in, garbage out is still the challenge. Nothing in, nothing out is a bigger challenge. So, underpinning it is the discipline that people need to have to log, but also underpinning the discipline is the why. Why will this help me? And the only reason to track and capture inputs is so that you can work out conversions, so that you can then optimize the process. But you can't do the optimization if you don't have data. So the practicality, you could frankly, if you're very boutique, there's this great thing called a paper and pencil, which...
Please explain. I'd love to actually hear the paper and pencil method. I thought you were going to go for a spreadsheet. So how would I do this on a paper and pencil?
I'm being slightly facetious here, but I mean, even if just someone, had a tally that they kept of, proposals created, wins, the numbers are pretty easy to work out. Clearly, a spreadsheet is going to be the digital basic, and then beyond that, you then get into, thinking about, HubSpot, Salesforce, Pipedrive, Sugar. And there's so many options that are out there. And there's so many other options with platforms where there's a CRM component that can plug in. So people might be using a PSA, for example, a CMAP, for example. Others obviously exist.
Oh, Ben regularly gets shouted out on this show. So we're very happy for that one, Alan. You'll get a message from saying thank you.
Well, within that, but, there's a CRM, component and module within that. So I don't think there's any reason not to, but it's then about how people configure the CRM to actually have meaning for their organization. And again, that's where we see some people go wrong, because for some people, it's just an advanced Rolodex, as opposed to being a source of customer insight, which enables them to build better relationships and actually underpins maybe some of the questioning that we talked about earlier on, because it's actually helping to highlight and uncover where some of the untapped value pools might be that are mutually beneficial both to the client and to yourself. So we would massively advocate having a CRM is, it's a foundation principle, which just makes your life easier and will help you be more effective.
Well, and I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. And this isn't about me, but the day I started creating Gauge, to your point of spreadsheet, I started a spreadsheet-based CRM. I wouldn't show you. It might be a bit embarrassing, Alan. You'll tell me it's not good enough, but having it is so powerful. And I love your point around garbage in and garbage out, because if you've got the most expensive CRM, and I should also say I bracketed very high with the 50 grand for a HubSpot or Salesforce. You can get both of those a lot cheaper for new firms. But actually, like you said, actually your paper was a great example of, if you're not writing anything down, it doesn't matter if you've got a pad of paper or a £50,000 system. It's not going anywhere. That nothing in, nothing out, I think, is really powerful.
Yeah. And I smile because, I mean, the last few years, we've seen enormous change and technological disruption but some of us are obviously concerned as well as seeing opportunities. So, there's that combination. My first sales role, and I'm going to slightly carbon date myself here, was 31 years ago. And within that, I worked with a very good sales. So I was an intern studying at Bristol University. I did a history degree, but I came from a family of, on one side scientists and the other side salespeople. So there's a sort of an interesting,
's a fascinating mix, maybe for another time.
It is, but that's probably why I've ended up being a consultant in terms of in sales. So it combines the two things. But within that, I had a great sales manager and mentor in the early days, and he taught me the value of tracking, and actually helped me see the benefit to me personally of, just like any process, define, measure, analyze, improve, control, classic basic building block, take the principles of Six Sigma, define your process in measurable terms, analyze the relationships between the stages, figure out how you can improve and put the control mechanisms in. And actually, that mentor of mine understood those principles as they applied to sales 30 years ago. And, it's really the basis on which CRM should be used, where, don't let your system define your process. Define your process, configure the system so that you're tracking and measuring what's needed. That gives you the visibility through the dashboards to analyze and identify the bottlenecks where you need to improve. And it also gives you the control mechanism, because what gets measured gets done. And visibility drives accountability, and accountability drives results. So, right at the heart, is that understanding that sales is a process. And like any process, it can be optimized if people take a sort of a process-based thinking approach to the way that they look to win business, rather than thinking it's all down to rainmakers who jump up and down and mythically clients fall out of the sky, which unfortunately goes back to democratization and the demystification of what selling is. As an essential prerequisite to democratize, you need to demystify. And this is the idea that it is an art and a science. And actually, can we create some of that science by creating the right tracking?
If you are enjoying today's episode, I would love to hear your thoughts. We thrive on feedback, and it would mean so much to me if you could take 10 seconds to go to your podcast app, leave us a review, and let me know how we are doing. Let me know what this podcast is doing for you. Let me know what you would like us to see, what guest you would like to hear from next. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better for you and for all of our other listeners. Thank you in advance. And now let's get back to the show. Alan, I think a great piece for us, and actually I think something that takes us probably into you might tell me it's not the final stage, but the next stage of the process, because we've talked a lot about how do I actually start conversations? How do I measure conversations? And this one, and it's quite personal to me, because I remember finding it was a version of what I'm going to ask you about. Your methodology is quiz. And I remember finding a version of it, and it has transformed sales, because when I started my business, I had no idea how to sell. And I remember some awful sales meetings where I probably did everything wrong that you've described. And so I'd love it if actually you could share that for our listeners, because I think we've touched on, I'm having a coffee, I'm measuring. If I'm about to get into a meeting with someone that's beyond a coffee, or I'll let you tell me if this works for coffees as well, can you explain what quiz is and how someone can use it for that sales conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll talk about the underpinnings of that, because we have a methodology. It's called quiz: question, understand, influence, solidify. Being very open with you and anyone listening, any good sales methodology says the same thing. And we see some organizations who jump from methodology to methodology in the same way that they jump from CRM to CRM, looking for the answer, not realizing that to get value, it's the change management that sits around that, implementation and successful execution of that methodology. The important thing for you within your individual organization is that there's a consistency and a common language that defines what good looks like, and the standard operating procedure, if you like, when it comes to every single aspect, right the way from demand generation, right the way through to conversion. So, 22 years ago, we created Quiz because it captured the best practices that we'd observed from, interviewing and watching thousands and thousands of salespeople. And, that's been validated consistently. One of the things that we frequently do with our clients at a diagnostic phase is go out and observe how they interact. And we'll use Quiz as the lens that we observe through, because we know that there's certain behaviors that are common to the way that successful salespeople engage. Now, what's really important here is we're not saying that you create robots. So the analogy we'd often use with something like Quiz is it's, in the same way, if anyone's met Nick face to face and me, the first thing they'll notice is that Nick's about 2 feet taller. We are never going to be mistaken for each other. I think it's fair to say. I have a Scottish.
You have a much better beard than I could ever aspire to grow, Alan.
And it's, I'm a Scottish heritage, so there's a little bit of strawberry blonde in there, shall we say. So that's all, aesthetics. I'd challenge anybody, though, if they saw an X-ray of myself and Nick, assuming that it was appropriately sized from the height perspective, to tell the difference, because the fundamental skeleton and the underpinnings is the same. And this is what we'd say with any methodology. You need to define that skeleton for what a great sales interaction looks like, and then enable people and allow people to overlay their authentic selves on top of it. Because what you don't want to do is create a group of people who are going out and engaging in a way that isn't authentic, because that will not help you build trust. But QUIZ stands for question, understand, influence, solidify. So very simple, high level framework, of which underneath that, there's 10 stages that we identify for a sales meeting. And then there's 4 techniques that sit over the top of that. And we refer to that as the 10-4, with the idea anyone who has a CB background, if anyone still does these days, 10-4 used to be the sign for message received. So that, how do we actually get our message across in a way that it will be appropriately received? It starts really with this understanding that sales interactions should start with the questioning, and we need to know how to ask the right questions to create 3 levels of understanding. People need to understand, we need to understand the context of the organization and the individual that we're dealing with. We need to help them understand the fact that we have credibility within the areas of which they're interested in. And actually, in our view, the best way of doing that is the quality of the questions that we ask is the best way to establish credibility, not the 10 slides at the start talking about who we are, how we work, who we've worked with. That needs to be woven in. But actually, those really insightful questions, I think we'll all relate to engaging with someone who convinces us that they know what they're talking about by really asking questions that make us think. The I is influence, and that's the stage where we have to obviously talk about why us. There's that credentials piece in a way that's relevant to the audience, and where we might start to, engineer the solution, co-create, the ideas. Here might be a way that we would address this. Other similar projects that we've worked on, couple of thoughts. And then the S is solidification. And that's all about, gaining commitment, not necessarily the commitment to the project, but what are the incremental commitments that need to happen across not our sales process, the buying journey and the buying process that the organization and the individuals need to go through in order to actually commit to the spend that would be required for a consultancy project. So question, understand, influence, solidify. As simple as that sounds, our observation when we observe and when we work with clients is we watch them pitch. So many of them, what they're actually doing is going straight to the I and the S, which is all about, us, if you like, as the selling organization, rather than them, the client. So the Q and the U should be all about the client. The I should be all about us in a way that's relevant to the client. And then the S should be about we. And that's how do we move forward in a collaborative way towards potential to work together. And, there's a huge mistake that we often see where too many sales interactions start with us, move on to a bit more about us, and then the people who leave with all the actions is us, because there's no skin in the game, mutual commitment, which enables us to actually qualify interest beyond just the words. And I'm sure many of us have been caught out by deploying resource onto projects where we convinced ourselves that there was opportunity, but there was actually no willingness in reality for the client. They just wanted some free consulting. So, there's huge pitfalls if people aren't deploying that type of approach, which, there's obviously lots of underpins that go beneath that, but hopefully that helps to maybe put some meat on the bones of how should a good conversation be structured. You're not going to go far wrong, in our opinion, if you approach it with that question to understand, to influence, to solidify.
I think a great explanation, and Alan, I think also just ties back to, a real theme through this conversation, and a great, I know I asked earlier, like, what should someone look out for? Your point of how much is us versus how much is them, or how much is client. And actually all of this, everything we've talked about seems to tie back, and I'll ask as a question so I don't put words in your mouth, is make it more about them. And actually the process tends to go better. Whereas a common fault with consultants that you've seen is we often start with the us. And like you say, sometimes to the data point, that, square peg, square hole, it works, but that doesn't help you improve your process, to your Demaic point.
Well, I think there's huge commonality here, Nick, with what we do and what your client centricity, I'm sure, is a continual conversation that you have as you think about campaigns. Are we thinking about, are we seeing the world through the client's eyes and the audience's eyes, or is it very much an inside out approach as opposed to an outside in approach?
Exactly, Alan. And this is where, if we had more time, or we've done it on one webinar, I'm sure we'll do another one as well. But it's exactly to your point, and you touched on it earlier, because it's something I do see a lot, is coming with a product and hoping to find a market. And often people see marketing as the solution. And that's where, and you mentioned around, like, ultimately selling is worthless if you're not delivering. If you're selling and just churning because you're not great, you will eventually get that reputation for good. You've got to have something people want to buy. Marketing is about informing them of the need they have for the thing, but you can only do that if they have a need for a thing. And that's where I think I'm a massive believer in what you said of ask people first. I think Adrian Bettridge said it when we were at the Consultancy Growth Network event, of actually, if you speak to one client, the chances are, if there's one CIO in a bank that has a problem, the chances are every CIO in the bank has the problem. Absolutely. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that as, well, I know the problem. Whereas, to your point, speak to the 10 CIOs or even 3 of them, and you will have the problem that you can solve, that you can sell, and you can market. So no, I'm a big believer. My only question on it, Alan, because I'm conscious of your time, and I also, because I love quiz and we didn't get to Intabo, which I'll let our listeners look up. Is there, and we can send this afterwards, but do you have a link on your website to the 10-4, to the quiz methodology? Absolutely.
There's a whole host of resources on the website, which is sbrconsulting.com. The website, depending on when people listen to this, they might go on and see, a website which has a purple identity on it because we're going through a rebrand. We're literally, going live on that shortly. And actually part of the reason for that is to actually build out, a more easily navigatable, who knows, way for people to get to the resources that are on there. Because whether it's webinars, blogs, white papers, there's that aspect of having done this for 22 years. There's a lot of resources that are there and available, which hopefully, help. And, again, genuinely, we're driven, we're passionate about, really driving professional, ethical, and effective methods of growth into organizations through process, people, platforms, all those different elements. So if there's something on there that triggers a thought, then useful. But there's certainly reference points for people on there if they want to dig in a little bit to what we've covered today.
Amazing. Well, what we'll do in that case is we'll put a link to the sort of insights or the resources section of your website, because it sounds like there's a whole host people can find. I also, as much because I think it's a great lesson for others to learn from, and I just wanted to touch on, you mentioned your quiz methodology is 22 years old. And I think that's, again, it's a marketing learning for people, is in an industry that focuses too much on thought leadership, it's actually great thought that gives you that leadership status. And I think that's what you're showing there, is you haven't created the quiz, whiz, diz, and whatever other methodology every year. You've created one that's tried and true. And for anyone listening from a marketing perspective, that's the way that you drive value. So I love that. I just wanted to say congratulations. And then, Alan, we are at the end of our conversation, and I always end with 2 questions, and I'm sure you're going to have some fascinating answers given what we've talked about, given the focus on sales. The first one, and we've just touched on a little bit of this actually, is in resources, is books. So I'm a big reader. I'm getting the recommendations from guests, and I'm not going to restrict you to sales. So I'm just going to ask, what is the book or books you find yourself giving to others or going back to yourself most, and why is that?
So the giving to others, there's one which I've given to many people. And the reason for that is it was given to me actually by the mentor that I mentioned earlier on. And that's a book called Man's Search for Meaning. It sounds quite deep, Viktor Frankl. And it's fascinating. It was from the perspective of the idea of between stimulus and response, everyone has a moment of choice. And actually, something that we've seen that does underpin people who are truly effective in growing businesses and winning work, let's say, on those journeys is resilience. And I don't think you'll find a better example or story of resilience than that one. And, obviously, that goes beyond just professional success. The ability to build resilience is enormous. So I've recommended that to my kids as well to, I think from a perspective, just a phenomenal book, which, we can all learn a lot from a business perspective, or actually outside of that. I'm a huge believer in reading biographies or autobiographies.
Any recent favorites?
So, what? I recently, the last one I read isn't a recent one, but I went back to it. It was Branson's Screw It, Let's Do It. And it was on the bookshelf and I had a spare minute. So I was flicking back through that and just, thinking actually there's some interesting stories and ideas. So it's certainly not a recent one, but that's the last one that I picked up.
Fantastic. Well, it's also a great autobiography. And to everyone who now thinks of Elon Musk, he, in some ways, was the Elon Musk of a different generation. Probably a bit more, I don't want to say Elon Musk isn't fun, I don't know him, but there was a fun edge to Richard Branson that was great. And your point on Man's Search for Meaning, I mean, we won't do a full book review here, but it is worth anyone reading. And just, for others as well, to your point, building resilience. And when your reference point is, a Nazi concentration camp and what actually, how he was able to come through that story, kind of puts all the rest of the problems you might be having today in your business, outside your business, into perspective. Because at the end of the day, PowerPoint isn't going to kill you.
100%. And as I say, my degree at Bristol was a history degree. So there's probably a reason why that resonated from that. That was a particular period of history I spent a lot of time studying. So interesting to bring a personal story, which has some very applicable lessons to, current context as well.
Definitely. And so our last question, and again, Alan, this one actually I am going to ask you to stick to the world of sales, because I think you'll have some brilliant advice, is you have three people in front of you. You can give one piece of advice to each, and I'll let you say whether that's one to all or one to each, but you have someone who's just starting in consulting, a graduate. You've got someone at what I'd know as a manager level in a sort of bigger consultancy, and you've got one who's just their approaching partner. What piece of advice would you give to each of them?
Yeah, great question. For the graduate, we mentioned it in passing earlier, your network is your net worth. And, that conscious and intentional approach to developing a network of, connectors, influencers, mentors is fundamental. And, often people say, well, it's a question you'll get asked a lot, Nick, how can you get us in front? And we need to get in front of more C-levels. Classic, right?
There's a whole question of what a C-level actually is, but that's for another day.
Absolutely. We can get into, and a very trite answer is we'll get to know them before they're at the C-level, so.
But it's not, sorry, I don't open this question up because it's a great point. Please elaborate.
From that perspective of this is that understanding of, the individuals who you engage, and that they're on a fast track. They're going to find a way under, over, round, and through, probably because they've got high levels of resilience to, and the ambition levels are there. So actually nurturing those relationships is just a smart thing to do, obviously in a way that's authentic, thinking about, well, who has that and who do you like and want to spend time with, but, not allowing yourself to fall out of touch. And, again, the question is always, how can I help? How can I help, that individual along the way? And, that's a common trait that we've seen with lots of people who achieve the sort of the rainmaker idea. But, at a grad, your network is your net worth. Be intentional in and around, managing that network. For the next level up, I think that goes back to, again, the curiosity led aspect. And actually at that level where you've got people who by then they'll have understood what the technical skills of delivering a project, and they'll probably have evolved to the point that they understand how to lead a project. At that level, what we'd often say to people is, think about what makes you successful in leading projects and leading change. And if you can just recognize those behaviors and apply them before you win the project, you'll do a lot better. Because the number of times we've watched people in a sales context, and then we've watched the same people kicking off a project, and the remarkable difference in their behaviors, where they're this caricature of, the worst of sales in a selling context. And then you put them in a situation where they're kicking off a project. Suddenly they're curious, they're empathetic, they're delivering insight through stories, they're drilling down on success criteria and success measures to really understand what's important. They're using past experience and insight to maybe shape that perception from the buyer of what they should be aiming at and how they might get there. And the thought is just, why wouldn't you do that in a selling context? And so with the principals who are maybe thinking, how do I move up? Just do what you do in a kickoff when you're successful. When you're selling, you'll be fine. And then with the partners at that stage, I think it's all about, how duplicable are you, and have you taken the time to really codify around, the standard operating procedure of the things that have enabled you to be successful, so that it's not just an unconscious competence where you get frustrated that others aren't doing what you do, which you think is obvious. Have you taken the time to codify that? And are you consciously competent and actually able to articulate why you're successful? Because if you can do that, you'll start replicating yourself in others. And, what we tend to see is most partners have an interest in growing their firm. One way you do that is by creating more partners. So we mentioned quiz earlier on. We actually did this with on a couple of occasions with organizations where, the aspiration was, how do we build partners? So we helped them to build a methodology where the acronym was partners, based off the principles that underpin quiz. But that had resonance with their culture and their organization. So that provided the track and the pathway to partner through, here's how you win business and here's the toolbox. Which goes back to the point we made. How do you democratize sales? You've got to demystify sales. So having methodology, structure, process, fundamental. So that would be my maybe slightly longer answer to your question.
I think some fantastic advice to end us on, Alan, all three bits. And I know I jumped in and I shouldn't have. And I say this to anyone listening who's younger than I am. Now I'm in my mid-30s, is when I was 21, I thought that there was a secret to getting to know the CEOs. Now I'm a little bit older. I realize, like you said, they're just the people you started with and went for beers with who have also grown in their career. And I think there's so much in that, as well as your advice to the other two. But that's for anyone who was like me thinking, where's that secret? To your point, what's the secret sales technique? Build that network. Your network is your net worth. I think it's a great phrase as well. I think, Alan, there's a lot of quotes that are going to be coming out of this. You might see on our social media as we come out of this interview.
And this is all about democratizing sales as well. If you want a culture, there should be cultural reference points within, and it's not as simple as having some mantras and some but that common language and actually that common set of reference points is incredibly valuable to help people actually get underneath the outcome, to actually understand the how you actually get there. So yeah, as I say, lots that we've stolen over the years, but there's some truism that sits within them.
Well, and the final piece, and you touched on it a little bit with your website, but if anyone wants to learn more about, that tried and true wisdom, learn about the SBR approaches, the methodologies we've talked about, where would you point them to? Where can they get in touch?
So as I say, website, sbrconsulting.com, very much, feel free to connect on LinkedIn, search under Alan Morton, SBR. really just genuinely enjoy conversations on this topic. You have enough of those conversations, taking care of the input. Some of them will lead to business relationships. Some will just lead to great network relationships. And email is amorton, MORTON @sbrconsulting.com. So feel free to reach out in any of those channels. Happily bounce ideas around or chat at any point. If there's anything that we've talked about today that's either resonated or sparked a question.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Alan. We'll put links to all of those in the show notes so anyone listening can go find them there. And all that's left to say is thank you. I've really enjoyed digging into these areas with you. As I say, I know we've talked a lot, and I think we've covered tons of areas actually today that we've never spoken about. So I've really found it valuable, really enjoyed it. And thank you to coming into Bath for the interview, Alan.
Nick, pleasure. Always good to see you.
Cheers. Today's episode is brought to you by Create Engage, the specialist digital marketing agency for the disruptive management consultancy. Now, for long-time listeners, you will probably already know who we are. You may have even heard one of our ads on a previous episode of this podcast. But for those of you who don't, here is a short introduction. At Create Engage, we help you create an effective marketing strategy for your consultancy, a strategy that will resonate with your target clients. And then we support you by delivering the campaigns you need to turn that strategy into a reality, helping you to build your brand, raise your profile with your prospective clients, and ultimately generate return on investment from your marketing activity. Now, I could tell you about many of the great clients that we work with and the results we've delivered for them. But instead, I'm going to do something much more powerful and something that I would recommend you do for your own marketing. I'm going to let our clients do the talking for us. If you are currently thinking about marketing for your consultancy, you're going to want to listen to this.
Create Engage started the process for us. They managed it end to end. They came up with some really creative ideas, and we were really happy with the work that they did, which meant that we could just focus on running the business. Not only did we start conversations with clients that we hadn't spoken to before, but also there was tangible return on investment by some work that we were given.
They've helped right from the initial shaping of the idea through to helping us work out what our end goal was. They've supported us with the visual identity and our positioning of the brand.
We've had an immediate expansion of our network and have initiated a raft of new conversations with owners, CEOs in target client organisations, and has led to us winning new projects already.
One of the greatest compliments, I guess, is that one of our competitors even said that they really like what we're doing with marketing and they wish they could be doing something as good.
So from our perspective, we couldn't recommend Create Engage any more than this.
I would certainly recommend Create Engage if you're a consulting firm. They really understand consultancies and the sort of challenges we face. And I don't think you're going to get much better marketing anywhere else.
So I wouldn't hesitate to recommend Create Engage. They did a really good job for us.
So if you're looking for an agency that can help you achieve the results that our clients just described, then head to our website, createengage.co.uk, where you can find out more about how we support consulting firms like you. You can download our latest ebook and you can get in touch to talk about how we can help you take your consultancy to the next level through digital marketing. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Climbing Consulting. If you have any guest recommendations, comments, ideas, thoughts on how I can make this show better for you, just drop me an email. It's nick@createengage.co.uk, and I really look forward to hearing from you.